Good morning, everyone. This is indeed a painful anniversary for a historian, perhaps, though, for a rather different reason. There's a morning when I don't wake up and read something which totally mangles the history of the Sykes-Picot Accord. It causes me considerable discomfort. Now, many who haven't read the Sykes-Picot Agreement presume that it advanced the Zionist project in Palestine. The Zionist movement celebrated Sir Mark Sykes as one of its own, so many have assumed that he must have designed the agreement to serve the Zionist interest. This is the view of some Palestinians. In the words of a Birzeit history professor this week, and I quote him, "Sykes-Picot was a carefully designed plan and prelude to the Balfour Declaration. The creation of Israel on Palestinian land would not have been possible without the Sykes-Picot Agreement." And he's not alone. When I opened over breakfast this morning my Jerusalem Post, there's an article on Sykes-Picot in Israel where we learn that the agreement politically and materially contributed to the realization of the Zionist vision, and that May 16th, 1916 should go down along with the day of the Balfour Declaration and the partition decision of the United Nations as milestones in the history on the road to the Jewish state. As I'm going to show, this is exactly wrong. In his memoirs, Chaim Weitzman wrote of Sykes-Picot that it was, and I quote, "fatal to us. The Sykes-Picot arrangement was not a full treaty," Weitzman goes on to write, "but it was sufficiently official to create the greatest single obstacle to our progress." So Sykes-Picot wasn't a prelude to the Balfour Declaration, but an obstacle that had to be cleared to reach the Balfour Declaration. And to understand that, all you have to do is look carefully at the map. But before that, just a word on Sykes-Picot generally to set the stage. It was the Arab activist George Antonius who famously wrote of Sykes-Picot that it was, quote, "the product of greed at its worst." But it was a product of fear as much as of greed, perhaps more so. And the fear was that in the aftermath of war, Britain and France, the old rivals, would clash disastrously over the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. Sykes-Picot had the same logic as Yalta 30 years later, an orderly partition to keep wartime allies from plunging into a new conflict after victory. And I think a good case can be made that when it came to preventing conflict between power rivals, Sykes-Picot was much more effective than Yalta. Preserving the balance of power was its primary objective, and in that respect, Sykes-Picot achieved its purpose. Now, this fear of clashing allies is most manifest in the Sykes-Picot map in its treatment of Palestine. Now, the first thing you notice is that Palestine doesn't fit neatly within the rubric of the big French and British zones in blue and red that are separated by the line in the sand. That map is in the entrance here. It's a bit obscured on your program, but the fundamental division was an east-west line. North of it was to be French, part of it independent Arab, and part of it direct French control, and part to the south, independent Arab under British tutelage, and then direct British control. The corner of the Sykes-Picot map is, in fact, divided 5 ways. 1, you'll see a wedge in the north of the country, including the tributaries of the Jordan above the Sea of Galilee, and part of the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. That is solid blue. That is, it's part of the larger Syrian coast, which was under exclusive direct French control. 2, you have the eastern shore of the Galilee and the Golan. They're marked off as part of the Arab state under French protection. That's Area A on the map. 3, you see that red blob around Haifa and Acre and the plain between them. That was to be under direct British administration. Britain wanted this as an endpoint for a railroad from Baghdad to the Mediterranean. 4, the bulk of the country, including Jerusalem, Jaffa, Nazareth, Tiberias, and Gaza, is colored, well, it was called brown. It looks a little yellowish here, but it was called the brown zone. According to the agreement, and I quote, "In the brown area, there shall be established an international administration, the form of which is to be decided upon after consultation with Russia, and subsequently in consultation with the other allies," that would have been Italy, "and the representatives of the Sharif of Mecca," that is the leader of the Arab revolt. And 5, and last, not least, the south of the country, including Hebron and Beersheba, as well as the east, Transjordan, were to be part of the independent Arab state or confederation of states under British protection. Okay? So the Sykes-Picot map constitutes the first partition plan for Palestine into no fewer than 5 zones. Lloyd George would later say, and I quote him, "The country was to be mutilated and torn into sections. There would be no more Palestine. Canaan was to be drawn and quartered. The carving knife of the Sykes-Picot Agreement was a crude hacking of a holy land," end quote. So why so many pieces? Again, balance of power. Sykes had hoped to create a land bridge from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, but other allied claims stood in the way. So the agreement regarding Palestine made concessions to the interests of every stakeholder: Britain, France, Russia, Italy, and yes, the Sharif of Mecca. Almost everyone. Absent from the list were the Zionists. 20 years later, George Antonius would call Sykes-Picot a shocking document. Whether it shocked the Arabs at the time is debatable, but it certainly shocked the Zionists in London in April 1917. That's when the British Zionist activist Harry Sacker got wind of it from a friendly journalist who picked up news of it in France. By the way, Sykes-Picot is a very poorly kept secret. It was known to the Arabs already in February 1917 and to the Zionists in April 1917. It wasn't published in Pravda until January of 1918. Sacker informed Chaim Weitzman, who was distressed to find the agreement displayed not a single trace of consideration for Zionist aims. Now, at this very time, Zionist leaders were in deep discussion about Palestine with British officials, including Mark Sykes. And Sacker wrote to Weitzman in disgust, "We have been lied to and deceived all along." Now, Weitzman was appalled by 2 aspects of the agreement. Look again at the map. First, the Sykes-Picot partition thoroughly divided the Yishuv. Many of the most veteran Zionist settlements, that's Metula, Rosh Pina, Yesod HaMa'ala, Mishmar HaYarden, would have been in the exclusively French zone, as would Tzfat. The Brown Zone, which is effectively an Anglo-French condominium, the Russians would be involved too, would include Jerusalem, Jaffa, and Tiberias, as well as the newer settlements such as Tel Aviv, Petach Tikva, Rishon LeZion, Rehovot, Zichron Yaakov. Weitzman called this division, in his words, a Solomon's judgment of the worst character. The child is cut in 2 and both halves mutilated. Where Sykes-Picot implemented, he protested, the Jewish colonizing effort of some 30 years would be annihilated, his words. Second, the agreement effectively put France in the driver's seat as far as the Jews were concerned. France would have full control of the Galilee settlements and would be on equal par with Britain in Judea and the coastal plain. Weitzman regarded France as wholly unsympathetic to Zionism. There was effectively no Zionist organization in France at the time, and far from facilitating Zionist colonization, France would block it. So what was he to do? Well, Weitzman's immediate move was to show up at the Foreign Office and to protest to Lord Robert Cecil, who was at the time acting Foreign Secretary. Weitzman's report of that meeting is the most thorough Zionist critique of Sykes-Picot. Weitzman denounced the proposed division between the Galilee and Judea in emphatic terms, and I quote him, "We would always consider this an unjust partition, and the Galilee would certainly constitute a Jewish irredenta. There is little doubt that the suggested division of Palestine would raise an outcry which will ring through from one end of the world to the other," end of quote. And as for international or dual control in the Brown area, and I quote him again, "It would be fraught with the gravest dangers. Any enterprise in the country would have to be sanctioned by both governments, Britain and France, and would lead constantly to jealousies." And according to Cecil, who also left account of the meeting, Weitzman even warned, quote, that the Zionists throughout the world would regard a French administration in Palestine as a third destruction of the temple. Must be one of the first references to the third destruction of the temple. And so on. From April 1917, Weitzman devoted himself and his movement to overturning Sykes-Picot. The Zionists had one aim, to swap this Sykes-Picot partition plan for an exclusively British protectorate over the whole of Palestine. Only under a British protectorate, Weitzman rightly concluded, could the Jewish home project take root and flourish. And Weitzman succeeded. In regard to Palestine, he managed to overturn Sykes-Picot entirely. Or was it really his success? In fact, he had plenty of powerful partners. By the time Weitzman learned of Sykes-Picot, many British officials wanted to shred it. They thought Sykes had given away far too much to the French. In particular, they didn't trust the French in Palestine on the flank of the Suez Canal, which was the imperial lifeline to India. And if the British and the Anzacs were going to do all the fighting and dying to liberate Palestine, why should Britain share it with anyone, and especially with the French? As Lloyd George later wrote of the armies amassing in Egypt under Allenby, and I quote him, "The redemption of Palestine from the withering aggression of the Turk became like a pillar of flame to lead them on. The Sykes-Picot agreement perished in its fire," end of quote. Even Sykes eventually backtracked from the agreement. He tried to get Picot to modify it and helped to formulate the Balfour Declaration. In 1919, the Zionist leader Nahum Sokolov wrote, and I quote, "From the standpoint of Zionist interest in Palestine, Sykes-Picot justly met with severe criticism, but it was Sykes himself who criticized it most sharply and who, with the change of circumstances, dissociated himself from it entirely," end of quote. So the Balfour Declaration was the first crucial step in the unraveling of the Palestine corner of the Sykes-Picot map. British military administration came next. The last nail in the coffin came in December 1919, when Lloyd George met with Clemenceau in London. "Tell me what you want," said Clemenceau. "I want Mosul," said Lloyd George. "You shall have it. Anything else?" "Yes, I want Jerusalem too." "You shall have it." So exit France and the internationalization, dual control. Sykes-Picot formally and finally came undone when Britain received the exclusive mandate for all of Palestine. It is the exclusive British protectorate that eventually made Israel possible. Israel probably would never have been born if the Sykes-Picot map had been implemented. So Sykes-Picot became a dead letter as regards Palestine no later than 1918. Has it left any legacy at all? I believe it did. The Sykes-Picot map proclaimed that no one actor could unilaterally determine the fate of the country. There were too many conflicting interests. During the Mandate years, Britain had enough power to call the shots alone, but only 20 years after Sykes-Picot, partition again became the solution to solving clashing interests in Palestine. So it has been from the Peel Plan of 1936 to the UN Partition Plan of 1947 and ever since. The idea of an agreed partition is the lasting legacy of Sykes-Picot. Even Israel's 50-year control of the country from the sea to the river since 1967 hasn't undone it. Other aspects of Sykes-Picot disappeared completely. The idea of an agreed partition of Palestine, proposed in 1916 but never realized, is likely to remain with us for some time to come. Thank you very much.